So, should you rent or buy a house in 2026? If you need to make this call right now, you have to be aware that there's so much bad advice online that just knowing who to listen to has become the hardest part. And this isn't a small thing to get wrong. It's arguably the biggest financial decision of your life. If you rent when you should have bought, you'll watch the same house that you can afford today fall out of reach while your savings sit there doing nothing. But if you buy at the wrong time, it's even worse. Because if you're like most people, you won't pay cash, you'll get a loan. Which means that if you buy right before prices drop, you're stuck paying almost double for a place worth less than what you signed for. But if you take the right decision for your situation, you'll be living the American dream of opening a home. And that's what this video is all about. If you don't know me by now, my name is Francisco. I've closed over 400 loans across more than $200 million in mortgage finance. And I've sat on both sides of this exact decision with clients every single day. So this is exactly how to make this call the right way. The first thing you need to understand is that there's one stat driving all this bad advice. Renting is cheaper than buying almost everywhere right now. And people are taking that single line and using it to make a decision that they'll be living with for the next 10 or 20 years. So let me do something that most mortgage guys won't do. That stat, it's true. On monthly cost alone, renting is cheaper than buying a starter in 49 of the 50 biggest cities in the country. On average, people are paying about 38% less a month to rent than to own. But that headline only gives you an average, and an average is a dangerous thing to bet, the most important financial decision of your life. That number lumps a city like San Francisco in with a city like Orlando and averages them together, even though those markets have nothing to do with each other. So the answer doesn't actually fit the city you live in. It's just an average. And the people online pushing rent or ever usually aren't trying to help you buy a home, but they're trying to sell you a course, a coaching program, or a fund to park your money in. So of course, they'll tell you to keep renting. But what actually decides your answer is two things: the math you run and the financing you walk in. When it comes to the math, most people compare their rent to the monthly mortgage payment. And whatever's lower, that's their answer. And that's why so many people rent for years when they shouldn't, or buy a house they had no business buying. Because when you pay rent, that money is gone the second it leaves your hands. But a mortgage payment is a different animal. Let's say as an example that your mortgage payment is $2,000 a month, and maybe $1,400 of that is your interest, your taxes, and your insurance, which is gone the same way that rent is gone. But the other $600 is principal, which is just the part that pays down what you actually owe. So that $600 doesn't disappear. It stays parked in your house until you pull it back out the day you sell. So what happens when people compare is that they take the full $2,000 payment, hold it up against rent, see that rent is cheaper, and they stop right there. And that's a mistake that I see over and over again, because $600 of that $2,000 was never money you lost. It was money that you saved. So when people leave it out, they're treating the cash that they get back as if it went up in smoke. So the fair way to do this is to put your rent only up against the money that you actually lose when you own your taxes, your interest, your insurance, and your fees, because everything else is just paying yourself. And the second that you compare it like that, a lot of the people who thought that renting was cheaper find out that buying actually cost them less. There was a study at the start of 2026 that ran these same numbers across the 50 biggest cities. And the headline that everybody shared said, renting wins everywhere. When you run it the honest way, buying was actually cheaper in 23 of those 50. Renting only came out ahead in the other 27. And these were the same houses in the same year. The only difference was running the numbers the right way. Now that tells us that whether buying or renting wins was never a national thing. It changes from state to state, and it changes a lot. But there's one thing that doesn't change no matter what state you're in: inflation. And honestly, that's the whole reason these studies keep coming back saying that renting beats buying, because almost nobody factors it in. Because if you think about what's actually happening when you rent and save up to buy, two huge things are hitting you at the exact same time. First, the money you're setting aside losing value every single year because inflation eats away at it. This year alone, inflation has eaten just about 4.2% of your total money's value, which doesn't even sound like too much until you wake up one day and realize that that thing has been going on for years, and now it is even over 30% of the sum that you've actually saved for a house. And the second thing is, I always find it weird when people say that they're scared to buy a house because they don't want to be stuck paying a mortgage. But then they'll go rent a place that gets more expensive every single year. And it's never going to be theirs no matter how much money they stuff into it. So they'd rather hand all that money to somebody else for a house that's climbing in value for somebody else, while the savings that they're trying to build to buy their own just melts away to inflation the entire time. And this is the whole part that nobody really talks about. When you're renting, you're already paying inflation. You just don't see it that way because your rent climbs with it every single year. A fixed mortgage does not move like that. The payment you sign today is the same payment 10 years from now. So while the renter's rent keeps rising, the buyers stay frozen. They're so scared of a mortgage that they basically end up spending years paying off somebody else's instead. Now, there are a couple of cities where renting is a better deal as opposed to other cities, but it highly varies. So if you're taking your advice from some guy online 3 states away in a completely different market, you could be making a 6-figure mistake on a rule that was never built for you. In the expensive coastal cities, for instance, owning is brutal right now. And San Francisco runs you around $1,600 a month more to own than to rent, with New York, Boston, and Providence all telling the same story. So in expensive cities like those, renting is better than other cities. But on the other end of the list, you've got cities where owning barely costs more than renting. So in Phoenix, the gap is under $200 a month. In Orlando, it's around $257. And Columbia, South Carolina is about the same. And once that gap is that small, the equity you build as an owner more than makes up for it. And if you look at where those cities are, almost every one of them sits in the Sun Belt, with Florida right in the middle of those markets where buying makes the most sense. Now, Texas is split, and Houston is one of the few spots down here where renting actually wins. So if you're in Houston, your math looks different than someone sitting in Orlando. So the takeaway is simple. There is no one natural answer because this was never one single market. And across most of the Sun Belt, which is where I do the bulk of my lending, the math is leaning towards owning. Now, there is a case study that goes around every few months that looks like proof that renting wins. But alongside of the inflation side that we covered earlier, it also rests on one thing that almost never happens in real life. And if you buy into it, you could end up taking yourself out of the best shot most regular people have at building real money. So imagine 2 people of the same age earning the same amount of money. One buys and one rents. And the renter pays less each month and skips the down payment. So he takes the money that he saves and puts it in the stock market every month. And after 10 or 12 years, there's a small chance that he has more than the buyer. So renting wins, right? Well, the whole thing is decided on one thing, whether he did it consistently or not. The renter only comes out ahead of the buyer if he takes that saved money and puts it in the stock market every single month for 10 years straight and never touches it, no matter what life throws at. And let's be honest with you, almost nobody pulls that off because investing is optional, and option is the problem. Because the month that money gets tight, or the car breaks down, or the job gets shaky, the investing is one of the first things that stop. But your mortgage, it's not optional. It hits every month, whether you feel like it or not. And a chunk of it pays down your house in the background, building your net worth without you even thinking about it. That's the difference. One plan only works if you've got perfect discipline for a decade. The other one works even when you don't. And there's a second problem with the whole renting and investing idea. It assumes that the stock market just hands you your money back with a juicy 8% average on return. But nobody actually knows what the market does over the next 10 years. It might average 8%, it might average 12%, it might sit flat right when you need it. So you're basically betting your future on a meme. Whereas properties, they don't move like that. It's slower, it's steadier, and over time, it just goes up. That's why 90% of millionaires in the US got there by owning properties and letting it climb for years, not by buying stocks. And a big part of why it works is the mortgage is the one thing that ever actually forced them to save in the first place. Now, there's one more piece that just about every rent versus buy calculator leaves out complete. And if you don't know about it, you'll start buying way short and walk right past the smartest move on the table, leverage. Now, what even is leverage? It is a very broad term, but for this case, leverage just means that you put down a small piece, usually 3 to 20% of the price yourself, and the bank covers the rest until you pay it back. But you still own the whole house and every dollar it gained. Because when you put $100,000 in the stock market, your return only comes off of that $100,000. But a house is different. Since you make money on the full value of the home, not just the cash that you put in. So if you put $60,000 down on a $400,000 house and it goes up in value, you earn that gain on the entire $400,000, even though only 60 of it came out of your pocket. And that's the part that nobody puts into the calculator. A while back, I had a client in a spot exactly like this. It was a high net worth investor who came to us ready to put $1.3 million in cash into one property up in Fort Lauderdale. And on the surface, paying all cash looks like the smartest move that you can make. But when we rewrite his numbers, that same $1.3 million used as down payment instead could control roughly twice the property. So we structured 2 deals at once, and now he owns 2 fourplexes right next to each other instead of one building. And both have already appraised at over $400,000 more than what he paid for each. He owns 2 fourplexes instead of one, and both are going up in value at the same time. That's exactly what leverage does for you. And it's the reason that buying can still beat renting, even when the monthly numbers look so close to each other. Because the money that you put down is doing 2 jobs at once. First, it's putting a roof over your head, and it's controlling a property worth way more than you actually paid in. Now, here's what almost every rent or buy calculator online gets wrong and nobody notices. Because they all assume that you just took whatever rate the bank first handed it. And your rate changes everything. Because a good house at a bad rate could be a bad deal. And a so-so house at a great rate could be a great. And real quick, before I show you how to get it right, if you're finding this video valuable so far, do me a favor and leave a like and subscribe to the channel. All right. So the first thing that you have to understand about your rate is that it's not some fixed number that they just handed down to you. It moves continuously. And when it moves, what it costs you to own that home moves right along with it. Sometimes by enough to change the entire decision. Not long ago, a buyer came to me already approved through her credit union at a 7.125% interest rate. And she was already a day away from signing. So before she did, we shopped her file and pulled 3 quotes from 3 different lenders. The best one came back at a 6.625%. We took that number back to her credit union, and the very next day, they called her up with a 6.75, which means that they had that better rate sitting there the entire time. They just weren't going to hand it over to her until they thought that they were about to lose the deal. And that's the part that nobody tells you about how lenders actually work, because they don't lead with their best rate. They lead with the rate that they figure that you'll just say yes to. And the only way that you get them to come down off of that number is by giving them a reason to. Freddie Mac even studied this. And buyers will pull just one extra quote, save around $1,500 over the life of that loan, off of nothing more but a few phone calls. And it's not even just the rate. Once you know what you're doing, you can skip paying points when they don't make sense. Get on the right type of loan for your situation and pick the lender whose terms actually fit your file. So this idea that there's a clean yes or no on whether you should buy was never real. How you finance it is what really decides it all. That same house that's a bad buy at one bank's rate turns into a good one the second you go and get a better rate somewhere else. So let's say you run your numbers and they're pointing you towards buying in your market. The good news is that you don't have to go about it the way that everybody else does, dropping a huge down payment, taking the retail rate, and paying full asking price. There's a handful of smarter ways to make sure that you get it done. The first one is rent to own, where you lease the house, but you've got the option to buy it later. And a little bit each month goes towards eventually buying it. And you buy down the road once your income's stronger or the rates have come down. The second one is seller financing, or instead of going to a bank for the money, you borrow it straight from the person sending you the house. So the seller basically becomes your bank. You agree on a price, down payment, and an interest rate, and a monthly payment, and you pay them directly every month with no bank in the middle and a lot more room to make the terms work. Now, why would a seller ever agree to that? Well, because they make good money doing it. Since they collect interest over time, they get the place sold a lot faster, and they pick up some real tax breaks by spreading that income out over the years instead of taking one big lump sum. And the third is house hacking, where you buy something like a duplex, live on one side, and rent out the other. So your tenant's rent covers a big chunk of what it costs you to own the place. And sometimes it could even cover the whole thing. And the timing on all of this is working in your favor right now, because around 44% of sellers are handing out concessions to buyers. That's money that you can turn around and use to buy your rate down and knock your payment lower from the very first month. So you don't have to be rich to buy a house the smart way. You just have to start thinking like somebody putting a deal together. And that's really the entire point here. Nobody online can tell you whether to rent or to buy, because they don't know your city, don't know your numbers, or the rate that you can actually get. So when somebody online swears that renting is throwing your money away or that buying right now is a trap, they're not lying to you. They're just answering for the average person, and that's never you. They're giving one answer for the whole country. And when your answer depends on your city, your numbers, and the rate you can get. And once you know those three things, you'll know exactly what move is right for you. So now you know how to actually make the rent or buy call instead of guessing off some headline. But even if you nail that call and decide to buy, there's still a strong chance that you overpay, because the rates you negotiate is just one of 5 places your bank makes its money off of you. And most first-time buyers never catch it, which is how they end up overpaying by more than $40,000 without ever knowing. So watch this video next, where I break down all 5, starting with the smallest closing day trick and working up to the one that can quietly cost you 6 figures, and show you exactly how to shut every one of them down before you sign.